Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to secure the APIs that are built using a Spring Boot application using the OAuth 2.0 access tokens generated by Azure AD B2C. So I'm going to show you the full end-to-end configuration of Azure AD B2C, as well as I will also show a demo of how to build a Spring Boot web application from scratch and then expose an API using that application and then secure those APIs using the access token generated from Azure AD B2C. But before getting into these configuration steps and then building the Spring Boot app, let's quickly go through this diagram which explains this end-to-end flow at a very high level. So let's say you have a client application and your client application wants to call some APIs that are exposed using a Spring Boot framework. In order to secure the APIs, you need to build some kind of an authorization layer around your APIs. There are multiple ways to do that, and one of the most commonly used frameworks or one of the most commonly used design patterns in the modern API world is to secure the APIs using OAuth 2.0 scopes. And OAuth 2.0 is an industry standard protocol, and you can search for that protocol in Google, and you will find the RFC, and you can go through it. So, in order to do this integration, the way it works is the client app will first call the Azure AD B2C token endpoints using the OAuth 2.0 client credentials grant, and Azure AD B2C will return a JWT access token with the scopes present in the access token. So let's say you want to call some API called read users, and the Azure AD B2C is configured to allow or deny access to that API using the scopes in the OAuth in the access token. Then when you call the OAuth 2.0 token endpoint, you will get an access token, and that access token can have that scope or it might not have that scope depending on the configuration. And then the client app will then call the Spring Boot API using that OAuth 2.0 access token. And Spring Boot app will then validate the token, like it will validate different claims within the token. It will check the token signature to see if the token is actually generated by Azure AD B2C. And if all the validations pass, then it will also check if the token has the valid scopes. In the example that I mentioned, it will check whether it has the read user scope if the client app is calling a read user API. And if everything passes, then it will return a HTTP 200 response along with the user details. But if the token is invalid or the token expired, or it can be due to multiple reasons, or it can be some junk token which some attacker is trying to pass. In those cases, the Spring Boot app will reject that token and return a 401 unauthorized error. But if the token is valid, but the token doesn't have the required permissions to call that API, like for example, in the case of read user API, if this token doesn't have the read user scope, then it will return a 403 forbidden error. And that's what you can see in this diagram in steps 5A, B, C. So there can be three different responses. It can either be a 200, which is a successful response. It can be a 401, which is a unauthorized, not authorized kind of error, and 403, which is a forbidden error. We can see all these scenarios when we do the testing, but at a very high level, this is how that end-to-end flow works. So before getting into the configuration, in case you have not already subscribed to this channel, I request you to kindly subscribe, and thanks in advance for subscribing. So let's now get into the configuration steps. So the very first thing that I would like to start with is to build this Spring Boot app. So I will use this documentation. I will share these links in the video description. You can take a look at it, or you can even search in Google and find these documentations. These are the official Spring documentation, Spring security documentation, where it talks about how to secure APIs using JWT tokens. So now I'm going to start with building a new Spring Boot app and then expose an API using that Spring Boot app from scratch. So I'm using Spring Tool Suite IDE, which is uh, which is similar to Eclipse. I think it is built on top of Eclipse. But if you want to use any other IDE, you are free to go ahead and use any IDE because it doesn't really matter. I am using Spring Tool Suite because I'm used to it, and then it has very good support for Spring Framework. But I'm sure all the IDEs have some kind of plugins to support the Spring Framework, so you can use any IDE. So I will start with the Spring Starter project. Let's name it as AADRS demo. Change the type to Maven because we are going to use Maven build and not the Gradle. Go to next. Here search for security and add Spring Security and OAuth2 resource server, and then search for web and add Spring Web and click finish. It will take a few seconds to a minute to create the project and build the project. So let's wait for that. But while this is happening, I will just quickly explain. So what we did here is basically we are building a new Spring Boot app from scratch and then expose an API through this Spring Boot app. That's what we are doing. Yeah, it's still building. I think it's done. Yeah. So this is the main application class, the Spring Boot standard application class. And now I'm going to create an API and expose that API from this application. So let's create a new class called user controller, and let's actually expose APIs through this controller class. So in order to expose the API, we need to add this annotation called REST controller. So let's wait. Yeah, so this got imported. Now let's add methods like get user, and I'm not going to talk about how to access some DB, get user details, all those things, because we are only focusing on the authorization layer here. So as of now, I'm just going to return a static string called access granted, read user details. Ideally, you will have some logic to call a DB to read user details. And now let's expose this method as an API. In order to do that, we need to use get mapping and add a path. And I'm going to call it as get user. So that's it. It's pretty simple in Spring Boot. You just create a Spring Boot app, then create these classes with REST controller annotation, get mapping annotation, and then you have an API. Let's quickly check that and see what happens. Like ideally it won't work. Like it won't work in the sense you won't get the response because we have added the Spring Boot security library dependencies. So what will happen is by default it will start securing these APIs. That's the beauty of Spring Boot. Like once you add these libraries, it will by default start securing these APIs. Now let's try calling this API. So we got the 401 unauthorized error, which is expected. As I said, now we are not passing any tokens in the API, and Spring Boot has already secured this API since we added these security libraries here. It automatically starts securing the APIs and it expects a token that needs to be passed in the request, which will then get validated, and then based on that it will either allow or deny access. So we need to do all those configuration, but we have just started with the very minimal configuration here. So let's add one more method called public string update user, which is basically like writing user details. Here also I'm going to do same thing. Let's not focus on how to build the database logic. Let's just see how to secure this API. And this will be a post mapping instead of a get mapping. And the path will be, actually ideally we don't even need to name these APIs as get user, update user. By default, a get slash user will be a get user. So let's just do that. So now we have two APIs. Let's start the server again. And let me remove this, copy this, create one more Postman. So I'm using Postman for testing. Again, you are free to use any REST API client that you are comfortable with. So now when I call get user, I get a 401 unauthorized. Similarly, when I call post user, I get a 401 unauthorized. So that is expected. So now let's actually go ahead and do the next step. So what we have done now is basically built a Spring Boot application and exposed a couple of APIs, which is get user and post user. Now let's go ahead and do the configuration in the Azure AD B2C. And for that, I'm going to use the official Azure AD B2C documentation. Again, I will share these links in the description, but you can go ahead and search in Google for client credentials grant Azure AD B2C, and you will end up in this page. So we have to start with registering a couple of applications. So let's uh, go ahead and register an application. So I'm already logged into my Azure AD B2C tenant in my portal.azure.com, and you can create your own developer account. It's free. You don't have to pay anything for some basic features like this. So you can go ahead and uh, register your email address in portal.azure.com and navigate to Azure AD B2C. So let's start with the very first application. Let's name it as user API AAD, just to say it's Azure AD. So this application will represent the user API. So let's register this and let's go to the app roles. So before that, let's quickly check this documentation. So if you look at this step one, we need to register a web API app, and then we need to define the API roles and expose the application, the API URI. So let's do one by one. So we registered the app. Now let's expose an API. So click add and let's modify this value. So in order to do that, click this settings icon, copy the domain, and then https:// that domain, whatever you copied, remove this one of these colon slash and make it like a URL like this. Click save. So this will be the application ID URI. Let's see where we need to use this while getting the token. But as of now, you can complete this step and then go to the app roles, create couple of app roles. One will be read user, allowed member is applications. Let's call it as read user and the description is read user details. Apply and update user, applications, update user and update user details. So now we have a couple of application roles. You can again check these documentations. So here in the documentation, they say how to add these two application roles using a manifest file. But I did that through the UI, but you can go to the manifest file and check both these roles are added there. So now we are done with the first step. Now we need to register a second application, which will now represent the client app. So basically what we did was we registered one application for the SpringBoot API in Azure AD B2C portal. Now we need to register another application which represents this client application. So the client app calls the API app using the token generated from Azure AD. So we need to register a couple of applications in Azure AD which represents this client app as well as this SpringBoot API app. So what we did was register the API app. Now we are going to register the client app. So I will call it as client app SBAAD, which basically means Springboot AAD, just for easy understanding. Click register. And here, if you see the instructions, it says go to the manifest file of this application and change this value to 2. So go to manifest, Control F, find that value, change it to 2, save. Then you can go through these steps, but I already know these steps, so I will show you. You can go through these steps later on. So now what we need to do is go to the API permissions tab and add a permission. Go to APIs my organization users, and this is the API app that we created in the previous step, which is user API AAD. Go here. As of now, let's select only read user and not update user. And I will tell you why. That is because I want to show you the how it works, like how this access token will work, and in order to test different scenarios. And later on we can add an update user. As of now, just add read user, click add permissions, and make sure you click this button, grant admin consent, and then you will see the status change here to granted for default directory. So basically what we did here is, as I mentioned earlier, we created two applications in Azure AD, one which represents this Springboot API app, one which represents this client app. And then what we did is we gave this client app the permissions to call this API app. That's what we did in this last step. So basically I added this read user permission to this client app, which means this client app has the permissions to call the read user API in the Springboot API app, but it doesn't have the permissions to call update user. That's what we will see in the testing. As of now, we are done with this. So I completed this step 2. I will show you 2.1 later and 2.2. Now we need to get an access token using this Azure AD endpoint. So copy this. Again, you can check this documentation. So copy this, go to Postman, open a new tab, paste it, change it to post, and we need to replace this tenant name and policy. So go to your Azure AD portal and go to the settings, and this is my tenant name, sec in action 101 Gmail. So replace this tenant name, replace this tenant name here as well. Now we need to replace this policy. So go to, I will actually open a new tab, right click, because I want to keep this page. I don't want to close it. Go to your new tab, go to user flows. You will see a default policy here already set up by default. When this tenant is created, copy that, paste it here. So the URL is now done. Now we go to the body, select the body X form URL encoded, and again go to the documentation. We need to pass all these parameters: grant type, which is client credentials. These are the standard OAuth parameters, OAuth 2.0 parameters that we pass for a client credentials grant. So client ID, leave it blank for now. We will come back to it. Client secret, leave it blank. We will come back to it. Scope. Now let's find the scope. So the scope is basically the application ID URI followed by slash dot default. So if you look at this app registrations and go to all applications, I created this user API AAD, and if you remember, we exposed this API using one application ID URI. Copy that, paste it here, and append slash dot default to that. And that's what this documentation says here. So the only parameter left is client ID and client secret. Let's again go to this client apps SBAAD. I actually misspelled it. That's fine. Go to certification and secrets. Create a new client secret. Name it as V1. Add, copy it, and paste it here. Please note that this secret can be copied only once. After that, it will be hidden from here. And go to overview. Copy the application client ID, paste it in the client ID. Now click send and you should get a token. Yes. So this is the access token. Let's check what is present in this access token using this website called jwt.io. So here you can see the access token which has multiple values. The key value here is the SCP, which is the scope, which has the value read user, which basically means this access token has permissions to call the read user API in the Spring Boot app. Now let's go back to our Spring Boot app and see how to secure this app using this Azure AD token that we generated. So before doing that, by default, when you create the project here, it creates an application.properties file. I'm going to rename it as application.yaml. So there is no harm in keeping it as properties, but I am more comfortable with the YAML format. So I'm renaming it as application.yaml. And now go to the official Spring Boot security documentation. And here you can see how to specify the issuer URI. The issuer URI is basically, in this case, is Azure AD B2C. So Azure AD B2C is the issuer which issues that access token using which this particular Spring Boot app is secured. So let's copy this, paste it here. So now we need to replace these two values, which is issuer URI and the audience. Now go to the jwt.io and here you will see a couple of claims called ISS and AUD. So copy this ISS, paste it here. Copy this AUD, which is the audience, and paste it here. So basically what we have done here is this Spring Boot application is secured using the tokens generated from this issuer URI, which is my Azure AD B2C tenant. In your case, it will be a totally different value here. And it only allows tokens with this particular audience value. So this audience is something, so if you look at this audience value, right? If you copy this grid and go to this user API AAD overview, you can search here. So this application client ID. So this token, access token, was generated for a client app for accessing the API, which is represented by this app in Azure AD B2C. So that's what that audience claim means. So now we have done the configuration. We need to do one more thing. So here we have not added any additional scopes. So before doing that, let's do one thing. So I got the token here, right? Let's use this token and call the same two APIs which were returning. So now it's returning 401 unauthorized. Oh, sorry, I need to restart. Yeah. So I'm getting a 401 unauthorized and 401 unauthorized. Now let's pass this token in the authorization header, the access token generated from Azure AD B2C. So the way you need to pass is go to headers tab, select the key as authorization, which basically is the authorization header, type BA bearer. space the token. Now send the request. Now you got the response. So which means the token is getting validated by the Spring Boot app. So do the same thing for update user. Select authorization, copy paste from the previous request, select send. So now you are able to call both the APIs, which is great. So what happened is from this diagram, the token got validated in step 4 and its valid token, it is coming from the issuer which we configured here in the application.yaml file. So the audience value matches. Now let's see one thing. Let me just delete one character from this audience, which is the last character, and restart. And let's see what happens. It should throw an error, return an error. So I got again 401 unauthorized because the token doesn't match with the values that are configured here. That's why you're seeing that error. Let me undo it. So now the tokens are validated, which is great, and then the API is secured. Now but the point is, it's not checking whether the token has the required permissions to call the get user API or the update user API. So now what we are going to do is go to the same documentation here, search for pre-authorize. So we are going to add a scope validation as well to both the methods and add one more layer of security, that not just the token that needs to be valid, but the token should have the necessary permissions to call the APIs. But in order to use this pre-authorized method, you need to enable method security in your Spring Boot app. So in order to do that, go to this authorization documentation, method security. You need to add this annotation for your app, enable method security. So let's do that. Let's go to my demo application class and enable method security. Now that is done, let's go back to the previous page, copy this pre-auth. Let's not copy. Okay, let's copy it. Let's copy this pre-authorize and go to this user controller and add it here as well as here, and just select this and it will show the import. So import it. So this, in order to call this method, you need read user scope. In order to call this method, you need update user scope. And if you remember, in the client tab configuration API permissions, we selected only read user scope, and that's why in this token you are seeing only read user. So basically what should happen now that I added these additional validations is that I should be able to call read user API but not the update user API because I don't have the necessary permissions in the token. Let's test it out. So when I call read user, I got the response. Now when I call update user, I got a 403 forbidden, which means the token is valid as per this diagram. Token is valid, but it doesn't have the required permissions to call the API. That's why you're seeing 403 forbidden. Otherwise, you will see a 401 error. So now let's do one thing. Let's add permissions to call update user API as well for this client app in Azure AD, so that it will generate an access token with both these scopes. So again, go to APIs in my organization, select update user, add permission, and let's select this, and we need to actually grant admin access. Yeah, now it is done. Now let's generate a totally new token. Sometimes it takes a minute or two for the Azure AD configuration to get refreshed, but anyway, let's give it a try and see if the new scope is also showing up in the token. Yeah, it's showing up. So that's good. So now you see two scopes instead of one scope. If you look at the previous one, it had only read user. If you look at the new one, it has read user and update user. Now let's use this new token to call both the APIs and see what happens. So I'm using this new token calling read user. I got the read user details. Now with the old token, I'm getting 403 forbidden. Let's replace it with the new token, which has the permissions to call update user as well. Yes. So I got the access granted update user details, which means this new token has permissions to call both the APIs. So this is the end-to-end setup. I know it's pretty complex and it's a bit confusing and there are multiple steps involved. So if you face any issues, feel free to post your questions or issues in the comments and I will try my best to respond back to you and try to resolve that issue. So again, what we saw is basically like a client app calling an API that is built using Spring Boot and secured using tokens that are generated from Azure AD B2C. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and again please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and support this channel. Thank you.